Welcome back, everybody. This is Jeffrey Reynolds from Reynolds Runabouts. One of the smaller projects to come into the shop is this 60.5 by 78.5 inch mahogany sailboat with a oak mast. These boats were made for a fundraiser by the local Red Cross by local artist Glenn McCune, who is quite good in building boats and other sculptures. And he built these boats, many of them, and then they would be sold to donors who would then donate the money to the Red Cross and then the boat to a local nonprofit. This boat belongs to the Charlevoix Historical Society, and I've been charged with putting a new surface on it, and the sails are being done by another artist. The sails are made out of metal and then they're decorated for the particular organization, so those are being redone. I will also be finding or sourcing new hardware for the boat because this is obviously not what a sailboat uses to sail, even if it's just a model. And my plan is to sand it down. This is a mahogany hull. It was laid up with several pieces of mahogany glued together or epoxied, I'm not sure. And I'm going to sand it down and get to the wood, do some filling with epoxy and sawdust. I collect mahogany sawdust when I work with mahogany lumber, and I will find a tone of sawdust that matches this closely, and I will integrate it into the epoxy and use it as a filler between these cracks or seams. And then once I get everything sanded down and the hardware removed, I'm going to treat it with Smith's penetrating epoxy system. Because this boat is outdoors, like almost all of them, I want to give it a really good chance at surviving, at least in the summers here in Charlevoix. And then I will put on multiple coats of exterior, meaning UV protected totable gleam type varnish, and I will do that both to the hull and to the oak mast, and then I will give it back to the Historical Society. It's mounted in a stone in front of their depot railroad museum, so it's quite cool to have it there. And yeah, so let's get to work. Here's some close-ups of the boat. So you can see I did a little bit of sanding already just to discover what sort of wood it was, and to verify it, and then to get an idea of what maybe was needed in the way of restoration, attention. This piece, which was, again, like this piece, this is more like conduit saddle or clamp and a piece of wire. So that'll be replaced by a true pond boat hardware that you can get. And yeah, so I'll just go ahead and work on all of that. I've got a hole in this table of mine because it has a pin or a shaft that goes into the stone when it goes back to its display area. But you can see it's not too bad. There's a little bit of separation, but I will sand that fair. Overall, it's done really well, and I look forward to talking to the artist about Glenn McCune about building these boats and how many he did and when he did it, and kind of what the inspiration was for the model. So I look forward to doing this project. So I use a random orbital sander with 80 grit to not only remove the old varnish and some of the gray wood that I already started, but it looks like some of the wood might have swelled this direction. So I gave that some fairing as well to kind of smooth out the deck. Careful not to get too close to the mast, because otherwise your orbital will leave a little slice into the oak. And I got to finish up the area where I took off the inappropriate hardware. There was one bronze screw, which makes me think something appropriate for a boat using bronze was on this at one time. The Charlevoix Public Library has one of these as well, and they do have appropriate sailboat hardware, but it was added. It wasn't original. So I'm curious to see some other of these. There's 3 boats I know of, and I've taken pictures of all of them, including this one. So it'd be interesting to see some of the original photos to know what kind of hardware they use. Maybe it was inappropriate then, I don't know. But this boat has so much belly to it that I'm going to have to use I'll use 80 grit for my foam in some areas, but I'm also going to do a lot of just using my hand to do the contours and try to get this back fair. Some of the things I see in the seams where the mahogany was glued together to make one big chunk of wood that then Glenn McCune then shaped into a sailboat. It looks like somebody over the years has added filler to the seam, some sort of caulk, probably a marine caulk or their thoughts. Maybe it looks like there's some silicone in there, which is inappropriate for wood. There's some gray filler in here. There's some white filler. So I might do some digging to get that out of there first, and then I'll go ahead and make that repair with epoxy, Smith's epoxy or West System epoxy, and then go ahead and tone that with or tint it with mahogany sawdust, so it should look pretty good. So I'm going to get to work on hand sanding the mast with just my hand because it is round. This is oak, and then I will move on to the hull and get her ready for the next repair. I have the boat all sanded down with 80 grit, and I did a little fairing up here, but I wanted to stop and make sure that I had put in the clear penetrating epoxy, but before that I also want to put in the epoxy that I'm going to tone and thicken at the same time with mahogany sawdust that I gather when I cut mahogany timber. I will keep this for such occasions as this where I need to blend in West System epoxy, which is clear if you don't tone it. And I also want to thicken at the same time, giving the seal, I'm not only filling it to keep it together, but I'm also filling it and trying to fade it into the rest of the deck of this boat. And that's how you do it. You use sawdust. Mark Gruten from Nomad Boating talked about that trick on his YouTube channel. I thought it was a great idea. I had never thought of that. And it serves as a great thickening agent too. If you're not trying to bond fiberglass or wood together necessarily, it has a little bit of bonding, but it has more aesthetic value than anything. So the first thing I'm going to do, clean up as much as I can of this area with acetone, just so that I can say that I've tried to get it as clean as I could. I vacuumed it, but what I want to do is try to get this as clean as I can around it, down into the crack with my fingernail even, to give that epoxy a really great surface to work with once it penetrates down into that wood. And I'm just going to drip it down in there so that I can try to fill it the best I can. And I'll probably end up putting tape down here on the end. We have an opening where the crack is just opened up. So I will go ahead and hit that and probably put a piece of blue painter's tape on that just to dam it, temporarily while the the epoxy pools, and then I can always sand that off later. Get all my paper towel out of the way. But this will give us a nice clean surface, which you should always do with epoxy. It gives you a nice clean surface to start with. Some of these other areas I might try. The cracks aren't that big, and I think they're going to fill in well with the varnish when I apply probably 10 or 15 coats of exterior Total Bolt Gleam, like UV protection varnish to this. So it'll do a lot of filling and flattening. So I've got my epoxy all mixed up, 120 stirs or 2 minutes of stirring. And then I just add some of this. And what I do is I try to run this through a strainer, if you want to call it, just to try to get some of the, you'll get bigger chips. And you need to make sure that this is more dust than chips. So I just get that going. As you can see, it's got a nice brown. And I have 2 different colors of mahogany dust that I can choose from. I chose the lighter one, knowing that this was going to get darker with the epoxy. That's pretty good. I'm just going to start with this couple scoops here because I'm not sure exactly how it will go down in there. So I'm going to just start applying that. I'll get some painter's tape and get that on there. My little dams, because I know this is coming. And that will stop the epoxy from spilling down to the side of the boat, creating more work for me. I take it right up to the shear line so that it'll fill in that really nice. Make sure that's well adhered. You don't want it sneaking out the bottom and then having to do more cleanup. The 80 grit paper I used the orbital on the top just because I think it gave it more of a fairing consistency, and then I hand did the other one several hours of 80 grit with a foam kind of a block that contours a little bit, and then a lot of sandpaper was just stuck to my hand, so it worked. So now I'm just going to take a little spatula that I started here with, and I'm just going to drizzle it down. If it was a little bit wider, I would use a syringe, like a veterinary syringe. Has a big enough opening where you can use that. But this has just a little too much narrowness to it, and the epoxy, I might cause more mess than if I just do it this way. So I'm just going to use the drizzle method, and I've already got some going down the side here. I'm going to just try to spatula it as best I can into that crack. This will get another sanding, so I thought this would be a good time to do this repair. Just scoop that in there. While I still have a couple sandings, I would do this and then open up the wood, get it cleaned out. I dug a lot of body compound or fairing compound of some sort. Some of it was blue, some of it was white, so it reminded me a little bit maybe of some marine fillers. It could have been what they call boat life, it could have been a Sikaflex, but it was really hard. It didn't have a rubbery consistency to it, so I don't think it was part of the 3M adhesive family. It wasn't silicone, but regardless, I went ahead and dug it all out with just a very sharp pick, and then kind of like reefing the deck seams or hull seams on a ship or a large sailboat. I just reefed it out with the ice pick, and that worked out really well. So I was happy to get it all out of there. I think it's going to be nice to have some nice adhesive or epoxy in here to not only bind what's the wood, the current position of the wood, but also to give it a nice filling so that hopefully it'll look a little more normal than the large crack that was created. Sometimes you can create larger cracks in boats, wood boats, by adding improper caulking. It doesn't allow the boat to flex. That's why they put cotton and then marine paint inside ship seams between the planks. That allows the boat to absorb water and become watertight for the most part, but also it allows the boat to flex. And this boat probably didn't have that type of adhesive in it. Now, not to say that this epoxy is going to move. I hope that with this and then the Smith's clear penetrating epoxy that I will put on after I stain, it will give the boat and the wood more flexibility and water resistance from the epoxy that will absorb down into the wood farther than any sealer you could put on, a normal sealer, like something you would put on after a stain application to a piece of furniture. It will allow the boat to resist absorbing moisture, and it will also keep the boat structurally stronger because now it has a really nice adhesive or epoxy glue holding it together versus, you know, a boat compound that was put in simply to fill the hole and hopefully not put any more moisture into the crack, but it if anything, it probably made it worse. So hoping that we can do a better job this time and not only get it glued back together the way it needs to be, but then to put those other chemicals in play to give it more strength, taking the wood that we already have and making it stronger. And then, of course, 15 coats of exterior UV protection varnish will really help protect not only the beauty of the boat that Glenn McCune created years ago, but also to keep all the work that I'm doing now safe. You know, not just the sanding, but also the repair, because the varnish, like all paint, varnish is just paint without pigment, and it's meant to protect the surface of the boat so that you don't have rot. And then once that surface is worn out by the sun or weather or abrasion, it lets that water into the raw wood because there's nothing protecting it anymore. And I hope to do as much as I can to keep that safe. And then proper maintenance, like any good boat. Every couple of years it should be revarnished, sanded down a little bit, and then more varnish applied, not only to make it look beautiful, but to protect it. Varnish was originally created, by seafarers to protect the boat that they were using to make money and to travel. And it's turned out to be just a beautiful chemical that allows, boats like this and beautiful runabouts to have a beautiful gleam at those boat shows. So that's one seam. I'm going to go ahead and put another application into this seam, and then I'll go back and see if it's absorbing. I'll keep adding because it's soaking into the wood as well. The clear penetrating epoxy will have its own tendency to absorb into the mahogany. Sometimes people will put a coat of that in and then put the filler in. This one, because it's so thin, I didn't do that, so I think we're going to be fine. Put the epoxy and mahogany sawdust mixed together and put into the seams. I'm going to let that cook overnight. It's absorbing, I can tell. And instead of just trying to figure out whether I can keep adding and adding and adding, I think I might just let this soak in, and it'll obviously will concave if it does, and there'll be little bubbles that will pop up. I'm going to keep an eye on those for a while, and then I'll go ahead and put another application in there tomorrow after it dries, and then we'll be able to sand it and see how the repair looked or looks, and then I'll be able to go ahead and do the stain and the Smith CPS, and then eventually varnish. So we'll let it sit for the night. Well, that completes the repair work. I've sanded it down with 80 grit. Did a little more fairing with the orbital, as you saw, which gave it a really nice rounded deck. A lot of it was a lot of raised edges. So I think putting the epoxy in with the mahogany filler helped smooth that out quite a bit. There's a few areas where I might put a little more epoxy, but I also know that several coats of varnish will eventually fill these areas. There are some white areas that you can see. These are, I like to point them out with a pencil here. These are voids. These are voids, meaning there were air bubbles. And when you have epoxy, you have air bubbles anyways, but when you add filler, sometimes it even makes it worse. Here's an empty one. These are full of dust still, so I'll vacuum those out. And I'll go in there with another, just a clear version of the epoxy, just to fill those in a little bit. And then the varnish will cover all those. As you can see, it's darker, it's the seam, but you know, it's the best I could do. I think it'll look a lot better than having clear epoxy. You would have been able to see down into the crack and maybe pick up some of the residual body filler that was used. So yeah, there's a few little things I want to do. I'm gonna vacuum these out and get more acetone on there, and then I'll just go ahead with a very thin layer of straight epoxy and just fill those gaps in. There's a few gaps back here that, you know, they were on the side of the boat. I might turn the boat and do a little filling here because I couldn't do it horizontally very well. I did fill in some areas in the back. This is where the hardware, there's a better view. This is where the hardware, or the sail and some of that maybe inappropriate hardware kind of gouged the wood. So I went ahead and filled those in an attempt just to try to seal the wood up and make it fair again. And the sail will be down into here, so this won't be seen, but it also kind of gives you a sense of the age of the boat. You can't always fix all the repairs. This is where the other end of the metal mat or the sail would have been rubbing probably. It didn't do it on the front, but another area that I filled were some of the holes. Let's see if I can get a picture. Some of the holes that I'm not confident were original. These appear to be original where the hardware was. And I might even fill those in, and then I will re-drill them. That way the wood will have a layer of epoxy in there, so it'll be safe. And when I put in the new holes, it will go into the epoxy and not into the wood, further protecting it. So yeah, I'm gonna do a little more follow-up on that, and then I'm gonna go ahead and put the Smiths on. I've completed the epoxy and sawdust mix application to these cracks where the wood that had been either glued or epoxy together years ago, several pieces glued together to make one bulk or block that was then carved by Glenn McCune and his wife. I want to now apply Smith's clear penetrating epoxy system, and this will soak into the wood. It's epoxy that's been thinned and then mixed with solvents that penetrate into the wood and then flash off, and then the epoxy adheres to the surface and down in a ways, but remains flexible because it's made from natural cellulose of trees. So it's a little different than hard epoxy. It has a little more flexibility to it. So not only will it help repel water, but it'll also allow the wood to move a little bit for expansion and contraction, which plywood doesn't necessarily do, but timber or solid pieces, regardless of the species, will flex. So this is what I always use when I do boats, to preserve not only the timber in the boat, but I also even apply it to my plywood, because it'll go down at least one veneer layer on both sides and protect it from water, and sometimes even help the paint or varnish that follows it to adhere even more to it. So it's really a great product. You have to get it on, and then you soak it in, and you just watch for dry spots, and you just keep applying until you don't see dry spots anymore. And that way you know you've gotten down to the point where it's now pooling, and that means that it's saturated as far as it'll go. And you just keep doing that. It has a pot life, which means distance in time that I can use it. And I use the cold formula, which gives me a little more time than the warm formula. You can get two different kinds. So I'm gonna be using this, and I'm gonna be wearing a mask, so I'm going to just put the video on and you can watch. I always use at least 7 mil gloves. 5 I use for painting and things, but 7 and 9 mil gloves are appropriate for acetone and Smith's CPS, because of the solvents that are in there that are trying to penetrate into the wood will penetrate right through the gloves and they'll just dissolve. So you don't need true heavy duty rubber gloves like you'd see, the big yellow ones or whatever, but you do need to have at least 7 or 9 mil just so your hands stay safe. So I'm gonna put my mask on, and this is a 1-to-1 mix. And not because I don't know how much this will soak in, I'm gonna start with a small batch because I don't wanna waste it. It's very expensive stuff. So I'm gonna do maybe 8 ounces total, so 4 and 4. And I do this to keep my cups separate, and then I clean them out so I can try to keep them as long as I can without throwing them away. And then I put them into a common cup, and then I use what's called a chip brush. These are disposable, and sometimes you'll need 2 or 3 of these because the solvents will start to dissolve the brush. So it's good to have that available, and I've got several. If I need to, I can grab some. But if the hairs start coming off, you should probably switch the brush, and you should be picking those hairs up. This will get sanded, in the end before I apply the varnish, but it's just good to try to get it as soon as you can. I'll do the mask separate. I'll put that on time lapse so that we can I can have it on its side and be a lot more doable for me to do that. So I'm going to put my mask on and I'm going to get to work. Now you can probably see how it dries out. This is what I have to keep applying. You just keep putting it on. Just soak, soak, soak until it stops doing that. So it soaks in and then it flashes the solvents. So what I do is I just keep applying until over and over and over again until I get it so it pools, and then I know I'm done, and then I go home. So even though I've got my mask on, I can still kind of smell the solvent, so I'm going to turn my fan on as well, and I'll put in the time lapse so you can watch. So I'm standing upwind of the project because of the smell. These solvents are powerful, and I wear a full-on vapor respirator, and with charcoal. I keep my charcoal filters separate and sealed, and after 40 hours you throw them away. And this one certainly came in handy. Even with the mask tight, good filters and a fan, these are powerful chemicals. So it's not necessarily going to hurt you as much as it smells bad. But that means they're working, and a lot of people swear by Steve Smith's formula on the CPS formula. So I've always used it and had really good luck. This will have a really nice surface tomorrow. It'll be glossy like it is now. And I kept going round and round and round until I got all the dry spots, to the point where now it's starting to get sticky. So I'm kind of losing ground. I'm picking up more hairs than I am putting down epoxy. So I'm going to let it go. There's a particular time period you can wait. I think it's 8 to 12 hours. I can come back and I can put another coat on, and I will do that in the morning. And that will help fill in any of the dry spots that I might find then, and that'll be the second coat. And then after that, I think you can wait 8 to 12 hours, and right after it gets hard enough to sand, I will start to varnish. I'm not going to put stain on that. The organization that owns this wanted the natural look, probably was what it was originally. There was no stain on it. I'm going to go ahead and work on that tomorrow, then I'll let that dry, and then I'll do the mask so I can do it in 2 parts and not get sticky on the rest of the boat. But this is going to be a natural looking boat the way it was built, and with a lot of varnish. A lot of varnish will follow, probably at least 10 coats, maybe more, just so we can get a nice flat surface and I can sand it out. And when we put it back on display at the Charlevoix Railroad Depot Museum, it'll really look sharp. So until tomorrow. I've completed the second application of the Smith's CPES epoxy, and I've sanded it down as recommended by Steve Smith with 220 sandpaper grit, and that takes a little bit of, if there's any sort of rough surface, and it preps, gives it a little hair, but also I left enough epoxy there where I can make a nice bind. It's been about 12 hours. And Steve said that the varnish and the epoxy will chemically bond within that amount of time as long as you don't take too much off, which I did. I went ahead and varnished the mast because I'm leaving the boat upright. It's just easier for me to put the varnish on. And I already did the mast because it's quite tall. Did that on a ladder and it went quite quickly. And what I'm using is Total Boats Gleam. I've used this before and really like it. It's a 1-part varnish, and it's recommended that you thin it if it didn't have an epoxy subcoat on there. With the epoxy, it makes the thinned application of varnish or sealer kind of redundant because I've already sealed it. So I've gone ahead and poured it through a filter into my my varnish tray. And then I use foam brushes. I find that I can get the bubbles out using the wet edge technique. I can do that. There's not enough boat here to roll with a 4-inch roller, so I'm gonna just go ahead and brush it on. And because there's probably at least 10 coats of this going on, I'm not wearing Tyvek. As I get closer to the final application, I'll have Tyvek on and everything so that I don't have any body hair or dust off my work apron onto the boat, because that'll be your final coat. So this Gleam is really nice. And to be honest, when a boat builder gets to the varnish stage, the smell of varnish is like perfume. It's kind of like you can see the finish line. Paint is another one of those things where you're putting the surface on the boat, and you're getting there. You're really close to having a beautiful product that, a little bit of hardware and onto the trailer. So I really I enjoyed opening up this can of varnish because I was so looking forward to this. And with this Gleam, like most varnishes, I kind of brush it on. Some people will use the back and forth technique. I use that more when I'm staining. And because this boat isn't going to be stained, and the surface is very flat, the grain is very flat, I'm just going to use the technique where you apply it, where I'm putting on the varnish, not heavy, and then I finish up so that I'm always brushing out to the previous. That leaves a wet edge here that I can then come back and do my next row, if you want to call it that. It's really easy on a boat this size to be able to do the whole thing without having to choose an area to focus on. You usually find hard corners so you can't see the edge of a stop and a start on paint. So I'm really enjoying vernishing this little guy because it's just so easy. Just a little bubble, I just pull it out. And this Gleam, I've noticed when I used it in the past, if you don't stir it heavily or shake it, anything that's going to introduce bubbles to the mix, you'll find that it's very forgiving in the way of bubbles. And the bubbles will pop out. All the solvents that come in paints, good paints and good varnishes, that's part of the action, is the curing process. The bubbles will evaporate and pop. And like I said, I have 10 coats of this to go. So there's going to be a lot of sanding between each coat and vacuuming and cleaning again with denatured alcohol. That's what Total Boat suggests we use, so I did that. And I agree, you don't want anything like acetone or anything heavy like that reacting with the epoxy underneath or softening it to the point where the varnish starts to get gummy. You never want that. And denatured alcohol is really easy to work with in the way of smell. I use it almost exclusively to clean and to prep surfaces, both glass and wood, because you can work without a mask, and it's really all you need to get the job done, to prep the surface, get it clean. You don't want to have something so harsh that it starts to react with what you just put on. You're just going backwards that way. And denatured alcohol is so much cheaper to purchase anywhere. Hardware stores and the like. You can get them at Marine Supply as well. So I've got the top done. I like it. I have noticed when I put the epoxy on, I noticed that the areas of this boat that probably saw the most weather, meaning sun and rain and other abuse, was a little darker. And when I put the Smiths on, it was really dark, and I was a little bit upset about that. But I went ahead and sanded it again at 80, and then with 220. And I think what happened is I made the surface not only smoother but shinier, and less Smiths penetrated to make it dark. So I was really happy when I put a test of the varnish on the area that had been darker before. Found out it was a lot more to my liking, and more of the original mahogany. There are areas on this boat that were damaged. There was literally gray wood, and I tried to sand it as much as I could. The one thing I could have done, I suppose, but it involves another step. You can bleach mahogany timber, but when you do that, you bleach the whole boat. Oak and mahogany will look the same. Problem is you have to then go back and give it color, meaning stain, and the organization didn't want stain on it, and to a lot of the purists, because this is what the boat looked like when it was built, it would have really altered the look of it. So I decided to go with what I could do with sandpaper and Smiths and varnish, and we'll let the boat have some patina, which is fine. We're going to protect it for the foreseeable future, and it won't get any worse, but it'll have a little history on it that can be told through the color of the wood. So yeah, I'm going to finish this up, and I'll let that rest. This is the morning after the Gleam varnish by Total Boat has been applied. It's already hard. I'm going to take some 220 grit sandpaper and just go over it lightly to take out some of maybe some dust, maybe some drips if I find any. I didn't see any last night. And I will keep doing this between coats, probably for 10 coats of varnish, and then the very last one, I'll pick a very still morning and come in and put the last coat of varnish on and let it harden without me being in the shop, so there's no dust. I'll have Tyvek on, things like that, to keep not only my skin and hair and everything else that a human body sheds, clothing, cotton off clothing, and just put a nice coat on there, and then hopefully get the sails back soon. They're metal sails that have artwork on them, and an artist is working on those right now. And then I'll know exactly what sort of hardware to put on here to make it look really good again, and get it back on display at Charlevoix's historic Railroad Depot Museum. So I won't be doing video of all 10 coats. That's not going to be entertaining to anybody. So I'll check back when I have the boat all done for you to see. So I've had the model sailboat that belongs to the Charlevoix Historical Society's historic train depot in my shop for a few years, and the sails are now complete. The sails were originally decoupage, which is they took postcards and they glued them and then kind of sealed them with a clear glaze. But obviously that didn't work for an exterior display, so they deteriorated. So uh, another Charlevoix artist, Linda Boss, worked with Lynn Jenks, who was the original decoupage artist, and with the donor of the boat to come up with a new design. And it was approved by everyone involved. And then Linda proceeded to paint these metal sails um, to work on just a new design that would last. And this is paint, so this will last a lot longer. It's displayed about 3 months a year in Charlevoix, and then we put it away in storage so it doesn't have to weather our spring, summer, falls, or spring, winter, and fall. And so I'm going to get this ready to transport back to the depot and get it back on display. But I wanted to give you a little tour of what I did in the final weeks here. So we have sails that were made by the Moran metal workers and then donated as long as just like the boat was done by Mr. McCune. They did the sails. And what I did, you remember we had some janky hardware. I went ahead and put on bronze and copper fittings. So I've used a bronze, what they call a strap or a saddle that you would see on a sailboat, older sailboats, and then I just added copper as my line. Did the same thing here based on some of the patterns I found in the wood. It looks like they had used a piece of copper or metal to keep the strap near the mast to the sails. And then I also repeated the same thing on the bow. Just put in some new hardware. I went ahead and made a new mast piece. This one was two different pieces of metal, one aluminum, one steel, and they both were in bad shape. So I went ahead and fabricated a new cross piece out of light steel and went ahead and re-drilled it and then painted it in the copper bronze. The mast wrapping or around the mast was original, so I just painted that as well. So the boat is ready to go. Take you around the back. This is what the back looks like. These are scenes from Charlevoix, Michigan. Many of these buildings are now gone to history. But very nice job, Linda. So I'm going to get that ready to put in my truck and take back to the depot, and I'll give you a little video of what it looks like there.